So, John, you've described the legal conundrums and the things that keep you awake at night. And clearly you're practicing law here in the U.S. So your references are to U.S. laws. How does this apply to people in other countries? Well, same scenario?
I mean, I think the concepts are the same, even though, the details of how the legal system works are going to be different. The United States, we've got a very litigious culture, and one of the consequences of suffering a major security breach is probably going to be a class action lawsuit in the United States. That is not going to follow in most other countries. So that's something peculiar to the U.S. But I think the overall concept that an organization, an enterprise, may suffer a negative security event that has some kind of harmful implications. I mean, obviously that's applicable anywhere. And I think anywhere that you're going to have some kind of regulatory body that is going to want to do something about it. Whether it's the same sort of penalty regime we see, whether it's maybe some kind of, we're going to take over your operations for a bit and fix you whether you want to be fixed or not, which is not something that happens in the U.S. But that might be something you'd get in another kind of legal environment. I think if you look at it conceptually, stepping up from the specifics of the law, you've got the need to anticipate bad things that could happen to your IT environment or in your IT environment, how it is that you deal with the fallout from that, which is no doubt in some fashion legal, but is also could be massively reputational. It's not probably very comforting if you're the head of IT, if your organization isn't subject to a class action lawsuit, if you lose your job and your reputation and can't get another job in your community. So, there are good reasons, quite apart from the particular U.S. legal environment, to take the same concepts and say, okay, we really want to make sure that we're covering ourselves so that we don't have those bad events and we're ready to address them. And I guess I would say, that's one of the biggest things for me that I've learned over the years is work with the concept of risk and be aware that since what you're doing is managing risk, at the end of the process, you're left with some residual risk. You can't operate without risk. The only way you can't have risk is not to do anything. And that's not an acceptable alternative. So you need to be as clear as possible about the risks that you do face to your legal people, to your operational people, internally with IT, and with the choices you need to make to address and manage those risks. And because you have unavoidable residual risk, you need to have a plan for what you're going to do when the bad thing happens.
So this is the chess game you're talking about.
Absolutely.
So can you give a couple of examples, John, of the kinds of surprises that you've seen or read about historically, to give examples to the students?
Well, I think one of my very favorites, just because it dates me so much, but from the very early days of the internet, was the Morris worm was the first worm ever invented by accident. And it spread, it was a very creative young man who figured out that if you could create this kind of self-replicating little program and it could spread itself, and he created it and it spread itself. And
wasn't he trying to do something helpful?
Yes, he was trying to, kind of do proof of concept and how would we prevent this threat from happening. And unfortunately, he created the threat and it happened. And at that point, I think it was literally the case that he was the person who anticipated that might happen. Obviously, there was technical knowledge out there that people were putting together, but he was the one who came up with the way to do it. But, sort of more broadly, I mean, just because it's front of mind right now, the overall vulnerability of the U.S. media ecology at this point to false information or distorted information or just drowning out of information. I mean, it's sort of a, we suffered a collective denial of service attack, if you will, I think is kind of the way I'm starting to look at it on our elections. So if you assume that elections are supposed to turn on people having access to accurate information as they would like to have it, you can accept or reject it, but you should know whether or not it's accurate. And it was very hard for a great many people to even know whether they were getting accurate information. And I think we should have seen that coming, but we didn't. So that's sort of a collective black swan, which I think is top of mind right now. But, I mean, as you go through lots of examples, the very first major database breach, which was actually the California State Comptroller database. As comptroller, that's the state financial administrative entity, and so they had, financial information, personal information on every California state employee, and they had, one of the first noteworthy database breaches, personal information database breaches. Of course. That was a vulnerability that they probably should have anticipated, but they didn't. But the fallout from that was that we got the first security breach notification law. California was the pioneer. Of course, I tend to think that a large part of that is because the data affected included data on California legislators, so they had a bit of a personal stake in it. But legitimately, their position, the position behind the law was, at the very least, if something like this happens, you should tell the affected individuals. And we now have those laws in at least 47 states in the District of Columbia, and in some other settings, we have got it nationally as well. And that was actually good fallout, but that was, sort of a nasty black swan.